A millionaire, Henry Blackwell, is living his life of luxury when one day he spots something shocking. A beggar on the street, wearing his missing watch. Outraged, Henry confronts the man, convinced the watch was stolen. But as the truth begins to unravel, what Henry discovers about the beggar's past is beyond anything he could have imagined. How did the beggar end up with such a valuable heirloom? What happens next will leave you speechless. Before we continue, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Henry Blackwell's polished leather shoes clicked against the pavement as he strode out of his office building, his mind already racing with the day's upcoming deals. The crisp autumn air nipped at his cheeks, a stark reminder of the changing seasons. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, a habit born of years spent perfecting his image. Then he saw it. A glint of gold caught his eye, drawing his attention to a figure huddled against the building's facade. Henry's breath caught in his throat. There, on the wrist of a disheveled man, was his father's watch. Henry's world narrowed to that single point of light. The watch had vanished weeks ago, leaving him feeling untethered, adrift without the comforting weight of his father's legacy. Now, here it was, adorning the arm of a stranger who reeked of desperation and neglect. "You there?" Henry's voice cracked like a whip. "Where did you get that watch?" The man looked up, his eyes clouded with confusion. It was given to me." Henry's face flushed with anger. "Given to you? That's absurd. That watch belongs to my family. It's been passed down for generations." The beggar's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, sir, but you must be mistaken. This watch was a gift." "A gift?" Henry scoffed. "From whom?" "I don't remember exactly. It was a kind stranger months ago." Henry's jaw clenched. "You expect me to believe that? That watch is worth thousands. No one just gives away something like that." The man's eyes hardened. "Not everyone measures kindness in dollars and cents, mister." "Blackwell, Henry Blackwell." He spat the words like a challenge. Recognition flickered across the beggar's face. The businessman. I've seen your name in the papers." Henry bristled at the man's tone. "Then you know I'm not someone to be trifled with. That watch is mine, and I want it back, now." The beggar clutched his wrist protectively. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwell, but I can't do that. This watch means something to me, too." Henry's nostrils flared. He opened his mouth to retort, but the man had already turned away, disappearing into the morning crowd. Fury coursed through Henry's veins as he stormed back into the building. He burst into his office, startling his assistant, Andrew Wallace. "Andrew, I need you to find out everything you can about a beggar who frequents the area outside our building." Older man, gray beard, wearing a tattered coat. Andrew blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry, sir." "You heard me. That man is wearing my father's watch, the one that went missing. I want to know how he got it, and I want it back." Andrew's brow furrowed. "Mr. Blackwell, are you sure? Perhaps it's just a similar-looking watch." Henry slammed his fist on the desk. "I know my father's watch, Andrew. It's been in our family for generations. That man has it, and I want to know why." Andrew nodded, his expression a mixture of concern and resignation. "Of course, sir. I'll get right on it." As Andrew left the office, Henry sank into his chair, his mind racing. How had his father's watch ended up on the wrist of a beggar? Was there some larger scheme at play? The possibilities made his head spin. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Detective Maria Jenkins speaking." "Detective Jenkins, this is Henry Blackwell. I have a job for you." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Blackwell, it's been a while. What seems to be the problem?" Henry explained the situation, his words tumbling out in a rush. When he finished, there was another pause. "Let me get this straight," Maria said. "You want me to investigate a homeless man because you believe he's stolen your watch. It's not just any watch, detective. It's a family heirloom. It's irreplaceable." "I see." Her tone was neutral, but Henry could sense her skepticism. "And you're certain this is the same watch?" "Absolutely. Will you take the case?" "Marie est. I'll look into it, Mr. Blackwell." But I have to warn you, these situations are often more complicated than they appear." Henry ended the call, a knot of tension forming in his stomach. He tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to the watch, to the beggar's defiant eyes. As the day wore on, Henry's agitation grew. By late afternoon, he couldn't take it anymore. He left the office, determined to confront the beggar again. He found the man in the same spot, hunched against the building's wall. Without preamble, Henry grabbed the man's arm, his fingers closing around the watch's band. "I've had enough of this charade," Henry growled. "Give me the watch." The beggar's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in anger. He yanked his arm back, surprising Henry with his strength. "Get your hands off me," the man shouted, drawing the attention of passers-by. Henry felt heat rising to his face as people began to stare. "That watch doesn't belong to you," he hissed. "Neither does it belong to you," the beggar retorted. "It was given to me by someone who no longer needed it, someone with a heart unlike you." The words stung more than Henry cared to admit. He released the man's arm, suddenly aware of the scene they were causing. "This isn't over," Henry muttered, backing away. As he retreated to his office, shame and anger warred within him. He had lost control, let his emotions get the better of him. It wasn't like him to be so rattled. His phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. It was Detective Jenkins. "Mr. Blackwell, I have some information for you," she said without preamble. "The man you asked me to look into. His name is Samuel Carter." Henry leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Go on." He used to be a university professor, quite respected in his field. But his life took a turn after his wife died. There were financial troubles, and eventually, he lost everything. Henry frowned. This wasn't what he had expected to hear. "What about the watch?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's where things get interesting, Mr. Blackwell. I found documentation showing that Samuel Carter once owned a gold watch very similar to the one you described. He sold it during his financial collapse." Henry felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. That's impossible. The watch has been in my family for generations." "Are you certain about that, Mr. Blackwell?" Maria's voice was gentle but probing, "Because the evidence suggests otherwise." Henry's mind reeled. How could this be? Had his father lied to him? What other secrets had Benjamin Blackwell kept? "I need to look into this further," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Maria replied. "I'll continue my investigation and keep you updated." As Henry hung up the phone, he felt as if his world had tilted on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about his father, about his family's legacy, was suddenly in question. He stared out the window, watching as Samuel Carter gathered his meager belongings and shuffled away from the building. The watch glinted on his wrist, a beacon of unanswered questions and uncomfortable truths. Henry's reflection stared back at him from the glass, a stranger's face overlaid on the bustling city below. Who was he really, without the certainty of his father's legacy? And who was Samuel Carter, this man who had unwittingly upended Henry's world? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, Henry realized that his pursuit of the watch had become about much more than recovering a lost heirloom. It had become a quest for truth, for understanding, and perhaps, though he wasn't ready to admit it yet, for redemption. The night stretched out before him, full of possibilities and pitfalls. Henry Blackwell, the man who had always prided himself on having all the answers, now found himself adrift in a sea of questions. And somewhere out there, a former professor turned beggar held the key to unlocking secrets Henry had never known existed. With a deep breath, Henry turned away from the window. He had work to do, truths to uncover. The real journey, he realized, was only just beginning. Henry paced his office, the city lights flickering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. His reflection haunted him, a ghostly figure trapped between two worlds. The watch, his father's legacy, Samuel Carter's past, it all swirled in his mind, a tempest of unanswered questions. A knock at the door broke his reverie. Andrew Wallace entered, his face etched with concern. Mr. Blackwell, I have the reports you asked for. Henry snatched a folder from Andrew's hands, leafing through the pages with feverish intensity. This can't be right. There must be some mistake. Andrew shifted uncomfortably. I've triple-checked everything, sir. The records are clear. The watch was originally owned by Samuel Carter. Henry slammed the folder onto his desk. Impossible. My father wouldn't lie to me. He said it was a family heirloom. Perhaps there's more to the story, Andrew suggested gently. Henry's eyes flashed. What are you implying? That my father was a thief? Andrew held up his hands. I'm not implying anything, sir. I'm just saying we might not have all the facts. Henry turned back to the window, his jaw clenched. The city sprawled before him, a maze of lights and shadows. Somewhere out there, Samuel Carter roamed the streets with a piece of Henry's passed on his wrist. I need to know more, Henry muttered. About Carter, about my father, about everything. Andrew cleared his throat. Sir, if I may, don't you think this is becoming a bit obsessive? We have the Meridian merger to focus on. The board is expecting. Henry whirled around. The board can wait. This is more important. More important than a multi-million-dollar deal. Andrew's eyebrows shot up. You don't understand, Henry snapped. This isn't just about a watch. It's about my father, my family's legacy. Everything I thought I knew. Andrew's expression softened. I understand, sir, but please, don't let this consume you. The company needs you. Henry waved him off. I'll handle the merger. Just get me more information on Carter and my father. Any connection between them. As Andrew left, Henry sank into his chair, his head in his hands. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on him, suffocating. The next morning, Henry found himself standing outside the gates of Carter University. The autumn leaves crunched beneath his feet as he made his way across the campus, following the directions to the Department of Philosophy. A petite woman with graying hair bumped into him, scattering papers across the ground. Oh, I'm so sorry, she exclaimed, bending to gather her documents. Henry knelt to help her. No harm done. I should have been watching where I was going. As they collected the papers, a gust of wind caught one, sending it fluttering away. Henry snatched it out of the air, his eyes widening as he read the letterhead. This is from my father, he breathed. The woman looked up, startled. I'm sorry, what did you say? Henry held out the letter. This letter. It's from Benjamin Blackwell, my father. Recognition dawned on her face. You're Henry Blackwell? Oh my. I'm Sarah Miller. I used to work with Samuel Carter's family. Henry's heart raced. You knew Samuel Carter and my father. Sarah nodded, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. I did. I was a social worker assigned to help the Carters after everything fell apart. I need to know more, Henry said, his voice urgent. About Carter, about my father. Please. Sarah hesitated, then gestured to a nearby bench. It's a long story, Mr. Blackwell, and not a happy one. As they sat, Sarah began to speak, her words painting a vivid picture of Samuel Carter's fall from grace. The brilliant professor, adored by students and colleagues alike. The devastating loss of his wife, Eliza. The spiral into depression and financial ruin. Samuel was too proud to ask for help, Sarah explained, her eyes distant with memory. By the time I got involved, he'd already lost almost everything, including that watch. Henry leaned forward. The watch. How did my father end up with it? Sarah shook her head. I'm not entirely sure. I know Samuel sold it to pay off some debts. But beyond that... She trailed off, then reached for the letter Henry still held. May I? Henry handed it over, watching as Sarah's eyes scanned the page. Her brow furrowed. This is interesting, she murmured. It seems your father was trying to help Samuel. He mentions wanting to make things right and repay an old debt. Henry's mind reeled. But why? What debt? Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her expression apologetic. I'm sorry, I have a meeting. But Mr. Blackwell, if you want to understand this situation, You need to talk to Samuel himself." As Sarah hurried away, Henry stood rooted to the spot, the letter clutched in his hand. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was one he wasn't sure he was ready to see. Back at the office, Henry found Andrew waiting for him, a stack of reports on his desk. "Sir, we really need to discuss the Meridian merger. The board is getting anxious." Henry waved him off, his mind still on the letter and Sarah's revelations. "Not now, Andrew. I need you to—" "No, sir." Andrew's firm tone caught Henry off guard. "With all due respect, this has gone on long enough. You're jeopardizing everything we've worked for." Henry's temper flared. "You don't understand. This is bigger than some merger." "Is it?" Andrew challenged. "Or are you just using it as an excuse to avoid your responsibilities?" Henry's fist connected with Andrew's jaw before he even realized he'd moved. Andrew stumbled back, shock and hurt etched across his face. The silence that followed was deafening. Henry stared at his hand, then at Andrew, horror dawning as he realized what he'd done. "Andrew, I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me." Andrew straightened, rubbing his jaw. "I think you do, sir. You're losing control. And if you're not careful, you're going to lose a lot more than just a watch." As Andrew left the office, Henry sank into his chair, the weight of his actions crushing him. What was happening to him? How had he let things spiral so far out of control? His phone buzzed, a message from Detective Jenkins flashing across the screen. Henry's heart raced as he read her words. "New information on Benjamin Blackwell and Samuel Carter. You need to see this." With trembling fingers, Henry dialed Maria's number. Her voice was grave when she answered. "Mr. Blackwell, I've uncovered something unexpected. It seems your father didn't just buy the watch from Samuel Carter. He had intended to help Carter out of his financial troubles, but something went wrong." Henry's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean, went wrong?" "According to my sources, your father set up a trust for Carter, but the paperwork was never finalized. Carter never received the help Benjamin intended." The room spun around Henry. His father, the paragon of virtue in his memories, had failed to follow through on a promise, had left a man, a friend, to suffer. "There's more," Maria continued. "I found correspondence suggesting Benjamin try to reconnect with Carter years later, but by then, Carter was on the streets," Henry finished, his voice hollow. As the call ended, Henry stared out at the city, seeing it with new eyes. The glittering towers, the bustling streets, and in the shadows, the forgotten souls like Samuel Carter. Souls his father had tried and failed to save. The watch on Samuel's wrist wasn't just a stolen heirloom. It was a symbol of a promise unfulfilled, a debt unpaid. And now, that debt had passed to Henry. He stood, a new resolve hardening within him. He had been chasing the wrong thing all along. It wasn't about reclaiming a watch. It was about reclaiming his father's legacy. The real legacy, not the polished myth Henry had clung to for so long. As night fell over the city, Henry Blackwell stepped out of his office, leaving behind the trappings of his wealth and success. He had a debt to repay, a wrong to right, and somewhere in the labyrinth of streets below, a man named Samuel Carter held the key to it all. The hunt for the watch had become a quest for redemption, and Henry was only just beginning to understand the true cost of that redemption. The city's neon-lit streets blurred as Henry's car sped through the night. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, mind racing faster than the vehicle itself. The weight of his father's failures and his own complicity pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of guilt and anger. He screeched to a halt at a red light, the sudden stop jolting him back to reality. A figure huddled in a nearby doorway caught his eye. Another lost soul, another Samuel Carter. How many lives had slipped through the cracks while he'd been chasing wealth and status? The light turned green. Henry accelerated, purpose crystallizing in his mind. He had to find Samuel, to hear the full story from the man himself. It was time to step out of his father's shadow and face the truth, no matter how ugly. Dawn was breaking as Henry finally spotted Samuel, curled up on a park bench. The watch glinted on his wrist, a beacon in the early morning light. Henry approached cautiously, his designer shoes crunching on fallen leaves. Samuel's eyes snapped open, wariness etched on his weathered face. "Mr. Blackwell, come to steal my watch again." Henry winced at the accusation. "No, Samuel. I've come to listen, to understand." Samuel sat up slowly, eyeing Henry with suspicion. "Understand what? How it feels to lose everything, to be abandoned by those you trusted." "Yes," Henry said softly. "All of it. Please, Samuel, tell me your story." For a moment, Samuel remained silent, his gaze boring into Henry. Then, with a deep sigh, he began to speak. The tale that unfolded was one of tragedy and betrayal. Samuel described his life as a respected professor, his world shattered by his wife's sudden death. The spiral into depression, the mounting debts, the desperate sale of his beloved watch, each word was a knife twisting in Henry's gut. "Your father," Samuel continued, his voice thick with emotion, "he promised to help. Said he'd set up a trust, get me back on my feet. I believed him, trusted him." Henry leaned forward, hanging on every word. "What happened?" Samuel's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Nothing happened. That was the problem. The help never came. By the time I realized it wasn't coming, it was too late. I'd lost my job, my home, everything." "But the watch," Henry pressed. "How did you get it back?" A ghost of a smile flickered across Samuel's face. "Fate has a strange sense of humor, Mr. Blackwell. A kind stranger gave it to me. Said it looked like I needed it more than they did. I had no idea it was the same watch until I saw your reaction that day." Henry's mind reeled. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was far from what he'd expected. His father, the man he'd idolized, had failed this brilliant man. And Henry, in his blind pursuit of wealth and status, had perpetuated that failure. "Samuel, I want to make this right. Let me help you, the way my father should have." Samuel's eyes hardened. "I don't want your charity, Mr. Blackwell, or your guilt. You can't buy redemption." "That's not what this is about," Henry insisted, his voice rising. "This is about doing what's right, about correcting a mistake that should never have happened." Samuel stood abruptly, looming over Henry. "And what makes you think you have the right to decide what's right for me? You know nothing about my life, about what I've been through." The argument escalated, their voices echoing through the empty park. Samuel's words cut deep, each accusation a reminder of Henry's privilege and ignorance. As the tension reached its peak, Samuel turned on his heel and stormed off, leaving Henry alone with the weight of his failures. Henry slumped onto the bench, head in his hands. He'd failed to make things right, failed to honor his father's memory, failed to help a man who desperately needed it. The watch, once so important, now seemed trivial in the face of the human cost it represented. His phone buzzed, startling him from his reverie. A message from Maria Jenkins. "New information on Benjamin Blackwell and Samuel Carter. Urgent. Call immediately." With trembling fingers, Henry dialed the number. Maria's voice crackled through the speaker, tense and excited. "Mr. Blackwell, I've uncovered something significant. It seems your father did try to contact Samuel years after their initial interaction. I found records of multiple attempts to reach out, but they never connected." Henry's breath caught in his throat. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your father tried to make things right. He set up a trust fund for Samuel, but by the time he managed to finalize everything, Samuel had already disappeared. Benjamin spent years trying to track him down." The revelation hit Henry like a physical blow. His father hadn't abandoned Samuel after all. He'd tried to fulfill his promise, but fate had intervened. "There's more," Maria continued. "I found a letter your father wrote to Samuel. It was never sent, but I think you need to read it." As Maria read the contents of the letter aloud, Henry felt tears welling in his eyes. His father's words were filled with remorse, with a desperate desire to make amends. Benjamin Blackwell had carried the weight of his failure to help Samuel for years, right up until his death. The letter ended with a plea. If you're reading this, Samuel, please know that I never forgot my promise. I hope that someday, somehow, I can make things right. As the call ended, Henry sat in stunned silence. The truth he'd uncovered was far more complex than he'd imagined. His father wasn't the perfect man he believed him to be, but neither was he the callous abandoner he'd feared. Benjamin Blackwell had been human, flawed and struggling, just like everyone else. With newfound determination, Henry stood. He had to find Samuel again to share this revelation. But more than that, he had to find a way to honor both his father's memory and Samuel's dignity. The path forward was unclear, but for the first time in weeks, Henry felt a glimmer of hope. As he walked through the park, his mind raced with possibilities. The watch that had started this journey now represented something far greater than a family heirloom. It was a symbol of broken promises and second chances, of the complex web of human connections that bound them all. Henry's phone buzzed again. A message from Andrew. Board meeting in an hour. Meridian deal on the verge of collapse. Where are you? Reality crashed back in. Henry had been so consumed by the past that he'd neglected his present responsibilities. His company, his employees, they all depended on him. But how could he go back to business as usual after everything he'd learned? As he stood at the crossroads, torn between his old life and the new path unfolding before him, Henry realized that the true test of his character lay ahead. Could he find a way to balance his business acumen with the compassion he'd rediscovered? Could he use his wealth and influence to make a real difference in the lives of people like Samuel? The watch on Samuel's wrist wasn't just a timepiece. It was a reminder of the precious moments slipping away, of the opportunities for redemption that could vanish in an instant. Henry knew he had to act fast, to find a way to bridge the gap between his world and Samuel's before it was too late. With renewed purpose, Henry strode towards his car. He had a board meeting to attend, a company to save, and a life-changing decision to make. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, but for the first time in years, Henry Blackwell felt truly alive. As he drove back towards the gleaming towers of the financial district, Henry's mind whirled with plans. The seed of an idea began to take root, a way to honor his father's memory, help Samuel, and perhaps redefine his own legacy in the process. The watch that had started this journey now ticked towards an uncertain future. But with each passing second, Henry grew more convinced that he could turn this tangled web of past mistakes and misconnections into something meaningful, something that could change not just his life, but the lives of countless others. The true test lay ahead. Could Henry Blackwell, the ruthless businessman, become the man his father had always hoped he'd be? Could he find a way to make amends not just to Samuel, but to all those who had been left behind in his pursuit of wealth and power? As the city skyline loomed before him, Henry took a deep breath. The next chapter of his life was about to begin, and for better or worse, nothing would ever be the same again. Henry Blackwell stared at his reflection in the polished elevator doors, barely recognizing the haggard man staring back at him. The once pristine suit hung loosely on his frame, a testament to sleepless nights and skipped meals. As the elevator ascended to the top floor of Blackwell Industries, Henry's stomach churned with dread. The doors slid open, revealing a corridor lined with anxious faces. Henry strode past them, chin up, projecting a confidence he no longer felt. He pushed open the boardroom doors, bracing himself for the storm that awaited. "Mr. Blackwell, so kind of you to join us," drawled Marcus Stern, the head of the board. His reptilian smile didn't reach his eyes. "We were just discussing the future of the company. Your future, to be precise." Henry took his seat at the head of the table, acutely aware of the empty chair beside him where Andrew should have been. "Gentlemen, ladies, I understand your concerns. The Meridian deal is dead in the water," Stern interrupted, "along with 3 other major contracts. Your little distraction has cost this company millions." The room erupted in a cacophony of angry voices. Henry's gaze swept across the faces of people he'd worked with for years, now twisted with disappointment and rage. In that moment, he realized how far he'd fallen, how much he'd sacrificed in his obsessive quest. "I take full responsibility," Henry said, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent. "And I have a proposal that will not only salvage our losses, but propel us into a new era of growth and social responsibility." Stern leaned back, skepticism etched on his face. This should be good. Henry took a deep breath and launched into his pitch. He outlined his vision for the Blackwell Foundation, a charitable organization that would work in tandem with their existing business model. It would provide job training, housing assistance, and mental health support for those struggling to get back on their feet. "We have the resources, the connections, the expertise," Henry argued, passion infusing his words. "We can make a real difference in people's lives while simultaneously opening up new markets and improving our public image." As he spoke, Henry could see the skepticism in some eyes giving way to interest. But Stern remained unconvinced. "Noble intentions, Blackwell, but this isn't a charity. It's a business. How do you propose to fund this little project of yours?" Henry steeled himself. "I'm prepared to liquidate a significant portion of my personal assets to get the foundation off the ground. And I'll take a 50% pay cut until we're back in the black." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Stern's eyebrows shot up. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious," Henry replied. "I've lost sight of what's truly important. This is my chance to make things right, not just for the company, but for the community we serve." The boardroom erupted in heated discussion. Henry sat back, heart pounding, knowing that his entire future hung in the balance. After what felt like an eternity, Stern called for a vote, all in favor of giving Mr. Blackwell's proposal a chance. Hands began to rise, slowly at first, then in a wave. Henry held his breath as Stern tallied the votes. Finally, the man looked up, a grudging respect in his eyes. "It seems, Mr. Blackwell, that you've been given a second chance. Don't waste it." Relief washed over Henry, but he knew this was only the beginning. As the meeting adjourned, he slipped away from the congratulatory handshakes and made his way to the street. The city pulsed around him, a symphony of life he'd been deaf to for too long. Henry scanned the faces of passers-by, searching for one in particular. He found Samuel in his usual spot, huddled against a building, the gold watch glinting on his wrist. "Samuel," Henry called out, approaching cautiously. "I need to talk to you." Samuel looked up, wariness etched on his weathered face. "Come to take the watch back?" Henry shook his head. "No, Samuel. I've come to offer you a job." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "A job? What kind of game are you playing, Blackwell?" "No game," Henry insisted. He explained his plan for the foundation, watching as disbelief gave way to curiosity in Samuel's eyes. "I need someone who understands what it's like, someone who can help guide our efforts. That someone is you, Samuel." Samuel barked out a laugh. "Me? A homeless man working for a millionaire's pet project? You must be desperate." "I am," Henry admitted. "Desperate to make things right, to finish what my father started." At the mention of Benjamin, Samuel's expression softened. Henry seized the moment, pulling out the letter Maria had uncovered. "My father tried to find you, Samuel. He wanted to make amends, to fulfill his promise. Let me do that now, in his name and mine." Samuel's hands trembled as he read the letter. When he looked up, his eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Your father, he didn't abandon me?" Henry shook his head. "He tried to make it right. Now it's my turn. What do you say, Samuel? Will you help me build something meaningful?" For a long moment, Samuel said nothing. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. "I must be crazy, but I'm in." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Henry threw himself into the foundation's work with the same fervor he'd once reserved for business deals. Samuel proved to be an invaluable asset, his first-hand experience and academic background bringing a depth of understanding to their efforts. As word of the Blackwell Foundation spread, other businesses began to take notice. Partnerships formed, donations poured in, and what had started as one man's attempt at redemption blossomed into a movement. Henry stood at the podium on the day of the Foundation's official launch, surveying the crowd. Faces that had once looked at him with disdain now beamed with pride and admiration. In the front row sat Samuel, cleaned up and dignified in a new suit, the gold watch still adorning his wrist. As Henry prepared to speak, a commotion at the back of the room caught his attention. Andrew Wallace pushed through the crowd, waving an envelope. "Henry," he called out breathless, "this just arrived. It's from your father's old partner, Edward." Henry tore open the envelope with trembling hands, reading the contents aloud for all to hear. The letter revealed that Benjamin Blackwell had set aside a significant portion of his estate for Samuel, a final act of friendship that had been lost in the bureaucratic shuffle after his death. The room fell silent as Henry finished reading. He looked up, locking eyes with Samuel. In that moment, understanding passed between them. The watch, the foundation, the journey that had brought them here, it had all been part of a greater plan, a legacy of compassion that spanned generations. Henry cleared his throat, emotion thick in his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we're doing here today is more than just charity. It's about recognizing the inherent worth in every human being, about giving people the chance to reclaim their dignity and purpose." He gestured to Samuel. This man, Samuel Carter, once stood at the pinnacle of academic success. Life knocked him down, but he never lost his integrity, his brilliance. Today, he stands with us as a partner, a friend, and a living testament to the power of second chances. As applause filled the room, Henry felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He'd entered this journey seeking a watch, a symbol of his father's approval. What he'd found instead was something far more valuable, a purpose, a calling that transcended material possessions. In the days that followed, Henry often found himself pausing in the street, really seeing the people around him for the first time. One afternoon, he spotted a man huddled in a doorway, desperation etched on his face. Without hesitation, Henry approached, reaching into his pocket. But instead of the loose change he once would have offered, he extended his hand. "Sometimes," Henry said, a smile spreading across his face, "all it takes is one second chance to change everything." The man looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. As their hands clasped, Henry felt the weight of the watch on his wrist. Samuel's watch, now returned as a symbol of their shared journey. It no longer represented a lost heirloom or a burden of expectation. Instead, it had become a reminder of the precious nature of time and the power each moment held to transform a life. As Henry helped the man to his feet, he knew that his father would be proud, not of the wealth he'd amassed or the empire he'd built, but of the legacy of compassion he was now creating, one second chance at a time. The watch ticked on, marking not just the passage of time, but the beginning of a new era, for Henry, for Samuel, and for all those whose lives they would touch in the years to come. In the end, it wasn't about who owned the watch, but about the timeless value of human connection and the enduring power of redemption.